We left off last time talking about the development and rise of communism and fascism in Europe. So, World War One, although everyone was trying to avoid something similar to it, really it sort of creates the possibility of a second Great War, a second World War. Now, World War II began really due to three main factors: the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression, and unanswered aggression. So we're going to deal with each of those individually. And I apologize, I've been battling allergies, so I may have to cough and whatnot like I did on previous lectures. Okay, so let's start off with the Treaty of Versailles. Along with leading to the rise of the Nazis, the Treaty of Versailles had quite different results on France's and Britain's relations with Germany and each other. Since they shared a land border with Germany and had suffered a great deal in the war, the French were much more nervous about a resurgent Germany, and they wanted to keep its power limited. So, in 1935, when Hitler announced that Germany would rearm, France signed a series of defensive pacts with Germany's neighbors in order to contain any future aggression by Hitler. Among these pacts was one with the Soviet Union, which France saw as the primary counterweight to German power. Britain, on the other hand, feared Stalin as much as Hitler, and they signed a naval pact with Germany, giving Germany the right to build a surface fleet of about 35% as big as Britain's and a submarine fleet as large as Britain's. While Britain apparently did not feel threatened by this, France did. So consequently, the two powers didn't really cooperate effectively in the late 1930s, giving disunity and lack of cooperation that was just what Hitler wanted. Aggravating the situation was a sort of shell shock among the British and French caused by horrible memories of World War I. Just as they had been too eager to go to war in 1914, now they were overly cautious and willing to appease aggressors in order to avoid war. Remember, I told you appeasement is the name of the game here. We must avoid war at all costs. Unfortunately, Hitler and dictators like him thrived on this caution. So just as the lesson of 1914 was that too much aggression can lead to war, the lesson of 1939 was that war can just as easily result from appeasement and giving in to aggression. We've talked extensively about the effects of the Depression on the West, so now let's kind of look at the East here. The Depression seriously hurt Japan, whose economy very much depended heavily upon trade to pay for resources and food for its growing population. As tariffs went up and the Depression deepened, Japan grew desperate for resources. Now, this desperation led to a military takeover of the government, which I mentioned in the previous lecture, somewhat reminiscent of the fascist dictators in Europe. In 1931, the Japanese seized Manchuria from China on the pretext of setting up the independent state, an independent state under Japanese, protection. China protested to the League of Nations, but the League had no power of its own to act against aggression, especially if that aggression was half a world away. So Japan kept Manchuria and kept a foothold in China. The Japanese killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese during its invasion. They raped thousands of women, and many were held as sex slaves during the occupation. And it soon went on, Japan soon went on to form an alliance with Italy and with Germany, beginning a series of aggressive acts that went unanswered by the League of Nations and other Western powers. Japan feared a united China, and they were... I'm hearing things on campus. There must be a group, so well, maybe you can't hear it. Anyway, okay, so let's get back to this. So, we see a stalemate developing between the Japanese and the Chinese because China is such a large nation. The Chinese were able to pull back, much like the Russians did against Napoleon. They pulled back, sort of a delay and wait tactic, and it's very costly. So the Japanese were able to convince some of the Chinese to join against the communists. When invading China, the Japanese basically cut all ties that they could have possibly made. The Chinese army was no match for the mechanized Japanese forces, which just brutally swept across the eastern seaboard of China. Cities were bombed mercilessly, populations massacred. The Chinese switched to a strategy of trading space for time, again, by retreating into the vast interior of China as a delay and wait tactic. And this drew the Japanese forces further and further inland, stretching their lines to the limit. Now, as a result, the Japanese decided to look elsewhere for easier conquests. In 1939, they briefly turned north against the Soviet Union. However, defeat at the hands of the Soviet forces, plus a surprise pact by Hitler with Stalin, convinced Japan to go elsewhere. So it turned to easier and more lucrative conquests in Southeast Asia. This involved attacking the colonies of France, Britain, and Holland, all of whom were too preoccupied with the war that had just started in Europe to really effectively stop Japan. In Italy, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Ethiopia. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini made an alliance called the Rome-Berlin Axis. Mussolini continued looking for easy conquests, while Hitler once again defied the Treaty of Versailles and sent troops into the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. Their orders were to withdraw if there was any resistance, but once again, there was no resistance. In Spain, we see a civil war breaking out in 1936, and Hitler and Mussolini supported the nationalists, while Stalin supported the Republicans. The ensuing civil war, once again, did not bring any sort of resistance from the League of Nations, and allowed Hitler even more time to work on his war machine. In March 1936, Hitler ordered troops into the Rhineland, which I just mentioned, and he got away with it. So he continued taking military actions in the opposite direction. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria without any opposition. Democratic powers did not step in for a number of reasons. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, tried to appease Hitler because he knew their army would not be able to stand up against the Nazis. September 29, 1938, Germany, Italy, France, and Britain met in Munich to determine what would happen with the Czech lands that Hitler had advanced upon. Britain and France gave in, hoping it would be enough to make Hitler stop. Okay, Hitler, now you've got some of the Czech lands. Stop it. Hitler's excuse for doing this was that there were plenty of people in Austria, his homeland, and plenty of people in this particular portion of Czechoslovakia that were actually German. So he's using a nationalist excuse, saying, I'm bringing my people home, as it were. So as he moves into the Sudetenland, France and Britain know that they've got to at least talk with him. So we have the Munich Conference, which was hailed as a great success to those in the West. But in the East, the Czechs and the Soviets were angry because they had no say in the matter at all. A few months later, without warning, Hitler sent troops to try to take the rest of Czechoslovakia and then advanced on Poland. France and Britain were finally convinced that that Hitler was not going to stop, and they were determined to stand up on him the next move that he made. Unfortunately, at the same time, Stalin was convinced that France and Britain would do nothing to stop any further Nazi aggression in Eastern Europe. So he signed a pact with Hitler that would carve up Poland between the Soviet Union and between Germany. A non-aggression pact was made with Hitler in late 1939, basically stating, hey, we, the Soviet Union, we're not going to mess with you, Hitler/Germany, as long as you don't mess with us, and, sort of in return for this, we would like some of the lands that we lost in World War I. So that's what the pact was about. Hitler launched a full-scale attack on Poland September 1st, 1939, and September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, thus starting World War II. So let's look at round one, the Axis powers. I will tell you we are not going to go into any sort of great detail, simply because there are certain things I'd like to highlight, and you can look in your textbook for greater detail. So round one basically goes to the Axis powers. Let's look. Between 1939 and 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan confirmed their alliance as the Axis powers after they signed the Tripartite Act. At the start of the war, it seemed like the Axis powers had the upper hand. The Germans developed the Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, which was highly coordinated airstrikes and quick deployment of tanks and other vehicles. Using the Blitzkrieg, Germans overwhelmed many of their enemies very early on. Hitler invaded Poland, and the Germans began killing Polish people on a wide scale. So if you remember, when we were talking about Hitler and his hatred towards people, it's not just Jews. It's anybody considered inferior. So that includes, guess what, those in the Soviet Union. So does Hitler have any desire to keep his pact with the Soviet Union? No, absolutely not. So anyway, just keep that in mind. You can't trust Hitler, right? For 6 months after the invasion of Poland, there was very little military action. In May 1940, we see the Battle of France beginning. It didn't take long for German troops to take control, however, and the battle lasted 5 weeks. In June 1940, France surrendered. Occupied France was mostly northern France. The French General Charles de Gaulle escaped to exile in Great Britain, declaring himself the leader. Great Britain was the last to hold out against Germany. Winston Churchill became prime minister. I love this quote by him because it just rings so true. He was a great speaker. So there's lots of things that he said about the war, but this is the one that I felt sort of summed it up. Winston Churchill said, "This is no war of chieftains or princes, of dynasties or of national ambition. It is a war of people and causes." In July 1940, Germany began massive airstrikes against Britain, London in particular, and it lasted for 2 months. By November, however, the Nazis were pushed back. So here we can see World War II in Europe, and you can see Germany here in orange. And after his expansion, you can see Hitler's Greater Germany. It has expanded out into this region. That which is in yellow, that's allied with Germany. Occupied by German forces or allied forces are in purple. So you can see huge portions of France, portions down here in Greece. Over here, getting into Eastern European lands. And then we have the Grand Alliance with the Soviet Union and Great Britain. And down here getting into what was the Ottoman Empire. So you can see the Soviet Union eventually turns around, huh? So, let's see, where are we? The Soviets were promised land that they lost in World War I when they signed the non-aggression pact with Germany. So they began annexing this land fairly quickly. Not every country came quietly, so the Soviets had to fight in order to maintain control. as I alluded to earlier, Hitler made known early on that he intended to take the Soviet Union. So in 1941, Hitler instituted Operation Barbarossa, meaning Redbeard. It's a sort of like a derogatory, just throwaway, we're going against the Redbeards now. Stalin knew an invasion might come, but he did not listen to any warnings about German troops invading. The weather worked against the Germans, because there's one country you don't invade, it's Russia, as did many of the Soviet people. But in the first 20 days alone, at least 600,000 Soviet soldiers died. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers died in the first 20 days of this Operation Barbarossa. The German war machine kept moving forward. By December, Moscow and Leningrad were within German reach. At least 6 million Soviets were either killed or captured during this time. The rough Russian winter set in, forcing the Germans to either stop or to retreat in some areas. So do you think the Soviet Union remained with them? No. They decided to switch over and become an ally as opposed to being an Axis power. Now, in Japan, after joining the Axis powers, Japan moved forward with its plans of imperialism. They occupied French Indochina, which was basically Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The U.S. implemented a total embargo on all exports to Japan. They said, we're not shipping them anything, right? On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. FDR, the president, called it a date which will live in infamy and immediately declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The Japanese went on to conquer a huge area in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific. The Japanese kamikaze were just as bad to fight against as anything the German Blitzkrieg offered, because kamikaze missions were suicide missions in which Japanese pilots would dive bomb their planes into targets missed or for other reasons. If a target needed to be hit, they would dive bomb the planes. Okay, so that's round one. Let's look at round two. Now, we've got 3 theaters of war here. And when we talk about theater, we're not talking about going to the movie theater, right? This is like a space, as it were. We've got the African or the Mediterranean theater of war, the European theater of war, and the Pacific theater of war. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on with the Allied powers. In 1942, the Battle of El Alamein was very important to Allied forces. This was in the North African campaign. Over several months, British and American troops pushed the Germans back. In May 1943, the German Afrika Korps surrendered. Then, to further protect British interests, the Allies attacked Italy. In July 1943, Mussolini was arrested, but German forces were still in Italy. So they freed Mussolini, and they took him to head a puppet government in northern Italy. Because does Hitler really intend to share power? No. So Mussolini is now taking orders from Hitler. The mountains slowed down the Allies, and the Italian campaign did not help the Allies as much as they had hoped. The Doolittle raid of April 18th, 1942 was the first U.S. air raid to strike the Japanese home islands during World War II. The mission is notable in that it was the only operation in which U.S. Army Air Force bombers were launched from an aircraft carrier into combat. And so lots of brand new things still happening, right? The raid demonstrated how vulnerable the Japanese home islands were to air attack only 4 months after their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. While the damage inflicted was slight, not a lot happened, the raid significantly boosted American morale while setting in motion a chain of Japanese military events that were disastrous for their long-term war effort. On the Western Front in Europe, lots of huge battles took place. After entering the war, the U.S. agreed with Britain that the main focus of fighting should be in Europe. In June 1942, the Germans began again the offensive against the Soviet Union. So winter's gone, we're picking up steam. They started from the south. By August, they'd almost reached Stalingrad. One author said that the Battle of Stalingrad was the greatest of the war, raged for 7 months. When the winter months started coming in, Hitler ordered his troops to stay. In November, they launched the final assault and made it through the Volga River. Then there was a stalemate for a couple of weeks. Soon the Russians began encircling the German troops, but Hitler still ordered his troops to remain through the winter. In January 1943, the Russians fully surrounded the Germans. The German commander asked for permission to retreat. Hitler responded, quote, "Surrender is forbidden." The German forces did, however, surrender not long after. And this battle greatly weakened the German force of supplies and manpower. So let's stop there. We'll pick up next time with Pacific battles, D-Day, and moving into the end of the war.